President will now present the interim assessment of the Commonwealth Observer Group on the electoral process thus far. We arrived in the country on 31st July, and our group was preceded by the presence of an advanced observer team which had been in Kenya since 19th July. We met with the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. We met with presidential candidates. We met with political parties, civil society, including women and youth groups. We met with media representatives, the Acting Cabinet Secretary for the Interior, the Commonwealth High Commissioners, as well as other national and international election observer missions. A number of our observer teams were deployed around the country on 5th August to observe the election environment and the preparations for the poll. Ahead of Election Day, our teams met electoral officers, political parties, the police, and other stakeholders at the county and constituency levels to gain a comprehensive picture of the electoral process and environment at these levels. The Commonwealth Observer team also observed the final campaign rallies of the two major parties. The following is an initial assessment of the critical aspects of the election process and the election environment. Our final report, which we will complete prior to our departure, will be issued at a later date. We laud the people of Kenya for the peaceful and orderly manner in which they exercised their right to vote on 8th of August 2017. We noted that the voters were able to cast their ballots freely. The elections were very competitive, with freedom of association and participation rights respected and provided for. We received reports, however, that the primaries conducted earlier this year had resulted in large numbers of rejected nominations, and this had resulted in an increase in the number of independent candidates which emerged in these elections. I'm going to skip the pre-election environment. I'm going to skip the media environment. I'm going to skip the electoral and legal framework. I'm going to skip gender parity provisions, and I'll go straight to Election Day. The turnout on Election Day was encouraging, and we noted from media coverage that there were long queues experienced across Kenya. There were reports that voters started queuing as early as 2 a.m. The majority of polling stations in which our group observed opened on time, despite some instances where slight delays were attributed to the late arrival of electoral material. Opening procedures not being finalized on time or as a result of faulty equipment. We noted that in these cases where delays were experienced, the IEBC extended voting time on a proportional basis to compensate for the late start of the poll. Queues were lengthy in many cases at the opening of polls as voters turned up in large numbers. Though the IEBC arranged for queue controllers to assist voters in identifying their allocated polling station, in some cases, due to large crowds, there were reports of voters being unable to immediately identify the correct polling station where they were supposed to vote. In most cases, the layout of polling stations was adequate, though there were some instances where the positioning of the voting booth was such that the secrecy of the votes may have been compromised. We noted that a significant number of polling staff and party agents were female. The voting process and prescribed procedures were largely adhered to throughout the day. Despite a compressed timeline and concerns about the efficacy of the technology employed, the management of the process by the IEBC is to be commended. Polling staff were professional, methodical, and meticulous in the application of procedures, conducting verification with the utmost care. We noted these efforts were directed at ensuring sufficient transparency in the presence of party agents that were at many of the polling stations. However, in some cases, this slowed down the processing time. Those voters requiring assistance, including pregnant women, the elderly, and those with disabilities, were given preferential treatment at the polling stations. We also found that despite some cases where polling clerks had to resort to alphanumeric entries, in the majority of voters were able to be identified through the biometric verification devices. On the whole, relatively few incidents were reported that had a significant impact on the voting process. Throughout the election day, it was also commendable to note that women made up large numbers of polling staff and party agents and continue to make up a significant proportion of those who voted. Party agents were evident in large numbers due to the number of political parties participating in these elections. This was commendable as it allowed for a high degree of transparency and oversight over the process. At the close of polls at 1700 hours, the majority of polling stations had a small number of remaining voters or no queues at all. All our teams deployed reported that the polls closed peacefully in their respective locations and that the counts were conducted efficiently and transparently. The count in general followed the prescribed procedures. There are reports of a substantial number of spoiled ballots indicating inadequate voter education. The adoption of new technologies by the IEBC for the transmission of results in the electoral process gave rise to questions of trust in the new system on the part of the opposition. We noted the decision by the Court of Appeal on 4th August to dismiss a suit by NASA which had called for the elections to be postponed in the event of a total failure of the electronic voter identification and results transmission system. We noted also the assurances provided by the IEBC that results will be transmitted both alphanumerically and through a scan of the results form from each polling station and from the constituency level. The media present here will recall that at a press conference on the eve of elections, which Mr. Mbeki and I addressed, we had stated that these elections will prove to be a crucial test of leadership for Kenya. We had called on all political leaders and others involved in the electoral process to play their roles with due diligence and to use their influence constructively to ensure that the process on election day, the counting, the announcement of results, and events thereafter would proceed smoothly and without incident. We noted the statements made by Mr. Raila Odinga and his agents in which he rejected the results being announced by the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission as fraudulent and illegal. And he called upon Kenyans to reject the results being issued unless, in his view, they were properly verified. We have viewed these statements seriously. We are mindful that the process of collating the results is still ongoing. I wish to reiterate my earlier call for leadership, and I therefore call upon all political party leaders and their supporters to show restraint and magnanimity as the results process continues to unfold. It is vital that all political leaders maintain peace and calm, exercise patience, and not stampede the process. The IEBC should be allowed the appropriate time and space to complete the results process with the necessary due diligence being exercised, and any grievances arising therefrom should be addressed through the prescribed legal channels. In this regard, we commend the reassurance of the chairperson of the IEBC that results will not be declared until Forms 3A and Forms 34A and 34B are corroborated prior to the declaration of the presidential election results. We are pleased to note that that verification process of these forms at the National Tallying Center is currently ongoing with the participation of candidates of all the political parties. Overall conclusion. We want to commend Kenyans for their patience and call for this to continue as the results process continues to unfold. We have followed the whole process and wish to congratulate all on the process thus far. It is my fervent hope and expectation that the positive, peaceful, and orderly atmosphere that we all experienced on 8 August will continue to prevail as we await the conclusion of this electoral process. Our overall conclusion is that the opening, voting, closing, and counting process at the polling stations on 8 August 2017 were credible, transparent, and inclusive. We commend and congratulate the Kenyan voters, the staff of the IEBC, political party agents and candidates agents, the media, and all security personnel for their commitment to the democratic process. They were efficient in the conduct of their respective roles, which contributed to the conduct of a peaceful poll on 8 August 2017. Finally, it is our hope that by bringing this electoral process to a successful conclusion, Kenya will serve as an inspiration for the rising tide of democracy throughout the Commonwealth. Our full assessment of the entire electoral process will be contained in our final report to be issued later. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.